Hello class, in this video I want to introduce you to some Jewish feminist thought, especially as it's presented by Melissa Raphael in the chapter that we're reading from her book, The Female Face of God in Auschwitz. I want to warn you, if you haven't already read this chapter, it's very difficult to read. It's very difficult to read. What happened to women and men in the Shoah, or the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust in World War II, is still devastating to so many people and to so many families. And so what Melissa Raphael does is to present us with a feminist theological interpretation of God's presence and absence in Auschwitz. And she undertakes this project because she believes that up until now, the kinds of theological explanations that have been given about the Holocaust have been mostly by men who have been much more concerned with preserving male honor and as well as using a model of God that is based mostly on male understandings of power. So a powerful male God, for example, warrior God, God of the universe, God that's in control of everything. So a lot of post-Holocaust theology, especially Jewish as well as Christian theology, has sort of asked the question of where is God? God was completely absent, or even then going much further by saying God allowed this devastation to be unleashed on Israel out of a show of power, or out of a show of indifference, or even out of a show of abusiveness. So there's a sense that in post-Holocaust theology, mostly written by men, there's a lack of imagination. Well, first there's a lack of imagination about how God might have been present to people in the camps. And there's also a lack of treatment of women's experiences in the camps, right? So just a lack of research on how women experienced death camps and concentration camps in the Shoah. And I use the word Shoah, which is another word for Holocaust, and it's just a word that, it's just another word for it that seems to have some resonance with people of the Jewish faith and as well as people in Germany. Lack of research of how women experienced concentration camps, but then also lack of research on how women were thinking and talking about God as they shared their experiences in the camp. So a lack of sort of Jewish female theologizing, if you will. And so Melissa Raphael is part of a long line of Jewish feminist scholars who is looking to kind of correct that. And this chapter does, I think it's a really good chapter that shows how women were thinking about God's caring presence in Auschwitz. Now, I recognize that we're talking a lot about mothering and maternalist things, so this chapter is called Maternalist Perspectives on Post-Holocaust Theology. This is not necessarily so much about the experience of being a mother as it is about the women who were mothers and daughters used the lens of their relationship to talk about God. And here's the crux, right? Maternalist perspectives are often being used today to try to construct a theology that talks about God as a carer, as a caregiver, as a nurturer. And so you don't need to be a mother to relate to this model of God. You don't need to have a child to relate to this model of God, nor do you even need to be a woman to relate to this model of God. But what Jewish feminist thought is trying to do, and what I want to try to do within the Christian realm, is to develop a theology of care, and not just a theology of sort of pastoral care that relies on psychological or emotional models of being, but really a model for God who is a caregiver, who is a nurturer. And this will help balance out models of God and the imagination of God that is warrior, that is fighter, that exerts masculine power, that works through violence and strife, right? The theology of divine care is the theology of a God who is present in times of weakness, but also who is giving care for life to continue and for life to flourish. So a lot of that is connected with maternalist or motherly perspectives, but it's not confined to mothers or to women or anything like that. So I want all of you to think about how you would develop a theology of divine care. And I think Melissa Raphael, this Jewish feminist thinker, actually does a pretty good job of that in this chapter on Auschwitz. Again, I warn you, this is a very graphic chapter. It's very, very painful to read. But what I want to point out to you, so part of, as I said, Raphael's project is to balance out post-Holocaust theology that relies and asks questions about God based on only masculine models of God. She relies very heavily on a concept of Shekinah. The Shekinah is actually not a word in the Bible. It comes from Meshem, which talks about God's dwelling place, where God dwells. So in Psalms, God dwells in the hills. The tabernacle in Jewish religion, ancient religion, was where God dwelled. So there's this notion in Jewish rabbinic literature called the Shekinah, the Shechem, which is God's dwelling place among people. And it referred to tabernacle and other parts of Judaism where we talk about God's presence and God's dwelling. So because Shekinah is a female word, feminist Jewish theologians have really capitalized on that to talk about God's female presence. And what makes Raphael's research very powerful is the way that these survivors of the death camps imagined God as well, based on how their female colleagues were treating them. So for example, I'm going to look at the book. So you might want to pull out the chapter and have the chapter in front of you. The first point that Raphael makes is that women survivors of the camps very often saw themselves through their family connections, so that the women who were survivors were saw themselves less as sort of individuals who were lucky or heroic, and much more connected to their family and their social relationships. So you can read Raphael about that, how the imagination of God as a carer gets developed through a sort of a theological understanding of one's close familial and friendship connections, right? And that's something that could be extrapolated to Christians and to even non-Christians, right? To think about a theology of care that arises out of the caring relationships that we ourselves experience in our lives. But again, this is a little bit different than, for example, what you're going to see with masculine theologies of the Holocaust, for example. On page 114, I think, is for me the most powerful story from her book. And it really illustrates what Raphael's getting at with a model of a divine carer. On page 114, she talks about Maya Nagy's, how as they were on a death march to Copenhagen, Nagy kept falling and falling, but the woman behind her kept kind of pushing her with her foot. She would just kind of push Nagy with her foot forward on the march. And she didn't have the strength to lift Nagy up or to carry her, but she had the strength to keep pushing her foot forward. And to me, that is a really beautiful image of thinking about God, how God is present in our lives in those kinds of ways. It's not a heroic intervention. It's not a pillar of fire. It's not a hero. It's not a fight, right? It's that in our lowest moments, in our darkest times of our lives, there is someone there. Maybe it's a friend, a colleague, a family member, a child, a spouse, a pastor, a church member who is nudging us forward very gently. And what's interesting here is that God's not showing God's face, right? This is not an obvious divine presence. The woman pushing Maggie was pushing her from the back, right? From the back, at the heel, at the very smallest point, right? In our lives. And that's just a great way of thinking about a female model of God and how women have operated in their own lives and how women have operated in each other's lives. All right, so you can keep reading this chapter, and I hope you do read it. But the point is that Raphael sees that the way that broken women in Auschwitz cared for other women who were more broken than themselves, that becomes the female presence and the female face of God. And so for there's one other passage I want to read to you. So for Raphael, the Shekinah, or God's female presence, is one that is a face of female suffering, but it's also an eternal presence that will not forget and not let that suffering destroy those females. Right? So on page 124 and 125, you also have the sense of a caring God that does suffer death. And this is where Raphael kind of connects it to the maternal, to mothering, right? That God's face in Auschwitz was the suffering face of mothers. And it was the suffering face of women who mothered other people. And so again, this can really be applied to all people who mother and who care for those around them. Even in their own brokenness, they're doing that. So this idea of a dying and deathless God is sort of central to the female face of God. And I think Shekinah is a great Jewish theology that Christians can also use, where God suffers the conditions of finitude. God suffers under the sin. God is present in the suffering and has a suffering face. And yet God is the one who lives forever and endures forever. And God is also the one, like Hagar in the desert, who eternally sees us, that our lives matter and that our lives cannot be extinguished out of God's own memory and out of God's own eye. And so again, that puts yet another dimension onto a theology of care. That when you are a caregiver in the name of God, you also see, you also witness, you see people suffering. You are present in people suffering, even though you can't help them get out of it, right, necessarily. And so I think this Jewish feminist thought is just an amazing addition to my own feminist theology, and it really has expanded my imagination about what it means to lift up female experiences. So Raphael writes about female experiences really from the edge, right, from the death pits of Auschwitz. But what if we were writing about female experiences of just our lives and the pits and the pitfalls and the hills and valleys of our own female lives? What would that look like to have space in our churches to be able to research and lift up that reality and then talk about how women are experiencing God in those realities? What would that be? Would it be someone pressing the heel of your foot as you move forward? Would it be a woman taking your hand, massaging your back? Would it be a woman bringing you food? Would it be you as the woman bringing someone food? What would it be? And that's really where I want to encourage you to think outside the box and encourage you to theologize from women's reality, and to think about models of God that are alternative to the kinds of models that dominate our imagination today. Class, thanks for your attention.